It's time to buckle up for a weird and wacky adventure, one that could only have come out in the 80s. Innerspace, where Dennis Quaid plays a disgruntled pilot, Tuck Pendleton, who goes on a mission to become miniaturized and be inserted into the body of a rabbit for research purposes. But after some good old villainous espionage, he's inserted into the butt of Martin Short, aka Jack Potter, a neurotic hypochondriac, where Jack now has sinister characters and all kinds of crazy shenanigans coming his way, where he teams up with Tuck's strained girlfriend, Lydia, played by Meg Ryan, in order to stop all the evil, douchey scientists, and to get Tuck out of his body. And wow, saying the plot out loud makes me realise how truly weird this movie is. So it's time to do what we've all secretly wanted to do since the dawn of time but never admit it: get miniaturized and stuck in Martin Short's inside. Why did I say that? As we look into 10 things that you didn't know about Innerspace. Like, now. Come on, let's do this. Wake up, Frank, let's go.
I'm in here, inside you, inside your body.
Oh God. Somebody help me! I'm possessed!
Number 10. The director felt like the poster let the movie down. Innerspace was produced by movie-making mastermind Steven Spielberg and directed by a guy who genuinely looks like a lot of fun to hang out with, Joe Dante, with the two pairing up again after the success of Gremlins, which was also a Spielberg-produced and Dante-directed caper. So Innerspace was destined to be a sure hit, except it wasn't. Well, not exactly. All up, Innerspace would make up to $42 million on its $27 million budget, much lower than anticipated, especially when you take into account Gremlins' box office intake of $212 million. And Innerspace had everything going for it. Two powerhouse filmmakers, its release being on the Independence Day weekend 1987, and the fact it got overwhelmingly positive feedback when screened for Warner Brothers executives. So why the lackluster reception? Well, Joe Dante put it down to the movie's poster, calling the ad campaign terrible, adding, quote, "It was just a giant thumb with a tiny little pod on it. You couldn't really tell it was a comedy. You couldn't tell anything." It seems that Dante also didn't like the movie's title, claiming that they just couldn't think of a better one. So it seems that back in 1987, people just weren't rushing out to watch Innerspace. But hang on, how did we even get here in the first place? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, to the days when the dinosaurs ruled the earth. Okay, not that far. But instead, the early 80s. Number 9. Innerspace started as a Fantastic Voyage ripoff. Innerspace was the brainchild of writer-producer Chip Proser, who previously wrote the script for a 1984 movie called Iceman, which is probably the only movie you'll see where Mr. Strickland comes face to face with a Neanderthal. Now, according to Wikipedia, he claimed that his Innerspace script was a rip-off of the 1966 science fiction movie Fantastic Voyage, which is about a submarine crew being shrunk to a microscopic size and placed into the body of a scientist to repair his brain. In fact, the word Innerspace was a line of dialogue from that movie. Only with Innerspace, the gimmick would see the man whose body the shrunken lead has been inserted into could still be a physical presence in the story and interact with the outside world. And so it seems that Rain Man and Batman producer Peter Guber liked the script and pitched it to Warner Brothers in 1984. So clearly they like what they saw and greenlit Innerspace, where the studio was getting ready for cinematic glory. And thus Joe Dante was offered to direct, where he said no. Number 8. Innerspace was originally not a comedy. So yeah, Peter Guber offered Joe Dante the chance to direct Innerspace in 1984, probably because at that time Dante was having great success with the as-mentioned Gremlins, to which Dante turned the job down. So it was decided to take Innerspace more in the direction of a comedy, because back then it was a serious science fiction spy thriller. It's been suggested by Dante that when Steven Spielberg and his Amblin company got involved in the production, it may have been Spielberg himself who decided to make Innerspace more of an oddball comedy. The Lost Boys and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade writer, Jeffrey Boehm, was offered to make rewrites to Chip Proser's original script. And like Joe Dante, he too originally turned the gig down, but he claims the production was insistent and kept asking him. But in reality, he found the premise of a man being shrunk down and placed in someone else's body to be ridiculous, and when you think about it, it is. But it seems that he pulled through and made those rewrites, and made Innerspace a vehicle more for laughs than sci-fi wonder. As Dante himself puts it, Boehm's approach was, what if we shrunk down Dean Martin and put him inside Jerry Lewis? Boehm himself added that he made it very loony, and really far out there, as when writing the script, he could really use his imagination, as because Spielberg was involved in the production, there was no bounds and limits in terms of budget. Number 7. At one stage, Spielberg was going to direct. Going back to co-writer Jeffrey Boehm, after the rewrites there was great interest in the circulating Innerspace script, and several directors were also interested in directing the movie, including Richard Donner and John Carpenter, and that when Spielberg did join the production, he originally was going to direct the movie, but ultimately decided to step down in favour of being executive producer instead, where in 1987, Spielberg would direct the war drama Empire of the Sun, which, let's be honest, might just be the most underrated Spielberg movie. But regardless, with Spielberg producing, Back to the Future director Robert Zemeckis was offered the director's chair, but he turned it down. Joe Dante finally came on board as director, and I guess he was now excited for the project. And the pair of filmmakers would have seemed like a winning combination thanks to Gremlins. Dante would speak very positively of his experience directing Innerspace, saying that at Amblin, you got the best equipment, best people, and best toys to play with, and also stated that Spielberg would even protect his crew from the studio and other producers. You know, those people who like to get involved in movie productions and meddle with them. Yeah, it seemed like that didn't happen. So it does seem from a movie-making viewpoint, if you were working with Amblin, you were looked after. Number 6. A character switcheroo. Now, originally, it was envisioned to have the Lieutenant Tuck Pendleton character to be an older character. You know, more of an older, wiser, more seasoned character. However, it was ultimately decided to make him a young man. Also, the original idea was to have the funny guy character be injected into the tough guy. And once again, according to Jeffrey Boehm, in Innerspace's early development days, there was an idea to have Michael J. Fox injected into Arnold Schwarzenegger's body. And that right there is a whole heap of weird. Oh god, yeah, just imagine Marty McFly stuck inside the Terminator. Why do I want to see this movie so badly? However, as the production went on, it was felt that it would be funnier to see the tough guy character to get injected into the weaker co-protagonist. Going back to the Martin and Lewis approach, it was felt that it would be funnier seeing Dean Martin getting stuck in Jerry Lewis's body than it would seeing Michael J. Fox getting stuck in Arnold Schwarzenegger's body. According to IMDb, Fox was interested, but Schwarzenegger wasn't entirely on board, as he wanted to branch out into comedies, but Innerspace was more of an action sci-fi comedy, so he turned the part down and starred in Twins instead, and thus Fox then lost interest. Number 5. Casting possibilities. So after the departure of Fox and Schwarzenegger, there were other actors who were considered for the two main leads of Tuck and Jack, including Mel Gibson, Robin Williams, Rick Moranis, Warren Beatty, and Ted Danson, but all were unavailable. Apparently Joe Dante really wanted to work with Tom Hanks and offered him the role of Jack, but Hanks was too busy filming Dragnet at that time, but the two would team up 2 years later for The Burbs. Ultimately, it was Dennis Quaid and Martin Short who were cast, both of whom were rising stars at that time. It seems that Quaid in particular was totally on board for the kind of wacky that Innerspace was, saying, quote, "It's a dumb, stupid comedy, which is exactly what people need in summertime," and further adding, "Leave your brain at home and you'll have a good time." Number 4. Overcasting quirks. When it comes to the henchman of Innerspace, Mr. Igo, the odd job of Innerspace if you will, a strange henchman whose artificial hand can turn into weapons and, sex toys. Originally, actor Luca Pakovicai was cast in the part, but it was felt that he wasn't intimidating enough. So Aussie legend Vernon Wells, who previously played Wes in The Road Warrior and Bennett in Commando, was cast in the part, and how brilliant he was. Innerspace also features a Joe Dante cast of actors who would frequently turn up in his movies, including Dick Miller, Robert Picardo, Kevin McCarthy, Henry Gibson, John Horner, Wendy Schall, Kathleen Freeman, and William Shallot. Going back to IMDb, Amy Irving, who was married to Spielberg at that time, lobbied to play the part of Lydia Maxwell, reporter and estranged girlfriend of the Tucker character, who gets caught up in the action. However, the part ended up going to Meg Ryan, who was also an uprising star at the time. In fact, Meg Ryan and Dennis Quaid met on the set of Innerspace, where they would spark up a real-life relationship and got married a few years later in 1991. Where they would go on to live happily ever after. Or at least until 10 years later when they got a divorce. Number 3. Inner filming. Innerspace was mainly filmed on sound stages in California, with some location filming taking place at San Francisco. 2 different shopping malls was used for the mall in Innerspace, those being Notch Ridge Hill in the San Fernando Valley and Sherman Oaks Galleria in Los Angeles. The special effects team used to create the visual magic for Innerspace was Spielberg regulars Industrial Light and Magic. And if you can believe it, a lot of the human cells seen in the movie were in fact Jello. And a great deal of Innerspace involves Jack talking to Tuck, despite Tuck being, well, tucked away in Jack's body. However, during the filming of those scenes, Dennis Quaid was still on set, reading to Martin Short his lines in a booth. Joe Dante did this so their interactions would be real. And the memorable scene where Jack's face transforms into the cowboy, well, in order to create those manic and surreal morphing effects, the Thing and RoboCop wizard Rob Bottin was hired to create these effects. And Innerspace is considered to be the first movie to show the modern selfie. And finally, for its Italian release, Innerspace had its title changed to Leap in the Dark, and Spanish translations retitled the movie to The Prodigious Chip. Number 2. Innerspace won an Academy Award. Despite its lackluster box office earnings, Innerspace actually got pretty good reviews from critics, and was well received by those who watched it. Joe Dante stated that when people went to watch the movie in theaters, they were in stitches, and as mentioned, put the low box office down to marketing. But also keep in mind that in July 1987, Innerspace was up against other big movies like The Lost Boys, Adventures in Babysitting, The Living Daylights, and La Bamba. It does go without saying though, that it did outperform Superman 4: The Quest for Peace and Jaws: The Revenge, but they were very low bars to accomplish. Innerspace also won an Academy Award at the 60th Academy Awards in 1988 for Best Visual Effects, beating Predator, which was also nominated. Yep, it seems that Arnie fighting an alien in the jungle was no match for Dennis Quaid being injected into Martin Short's butt. And the award was presented by Sean Connery, no less. And yes, he refers to the movie as Innerspace.
For Innerspace.
It seemed that Innerspace was loved by those who watched it. The problem is, not many people were watching it. Number 1. The popularity of Innerspace took off on home video. According to Wikipedia, Joe Dante has claimed that Innerspace's popularity seemed to really take off thanks to home video. The marketing of the movie was replaced with different, more appealing artwork, and that it just seemed to really resonate with people who were renting it from video stores. And so the movie's stardom took off from there, where it would become a cult movie. But to be honest, Innerspace is just so absurd and wild with how crazy it can be, it's kind of a film that was destined to be overlooked upon its release because its weirdness goes beyond mainstream and become a cult movie. It's almost the epitome of cult movie. As recent as 2024, Dennis Quaid has stated that Innerspace is the movie that he gets the most recognised for, on an international level. He gave an example where he could be in India and have someone approach him and say, "Hey, you were in Innerspace." To conclude, Innerspace is a movie that is a lot of fun. It's kind of a 1980s take on wacky 1950s and 1960s B movies, but it also has a slapstick Looney Tunes aesthetic. It is genuinely a fun, easy to digest movie that's guaranteed to please and entertain, and give people that joyful thrill of going on a trip down memory lane to a more pleasant time. A time where things could just be really insane and wacky and really lots of fun. I like Innerspace. You like Innerspace. We all like Innerspace. But the problem is, no one was really watching it when it was released. But you know what? That happens sometimes. But how much a movie may or may not make in the box office never determines if it actually is a good movie. Just remember that. Anyway, I'm Minty, and Innerspace is merely simplistic popcorn fun of the highest quality. And I love it. See ya!